What would you do if the most feared creature in your entire territory wasn't a monster at all, but a broken soul waiting for the first gentle hand it had ever known? For years, people whispered about the giant savage horse chained in the dust square, a beast said to kill without warning, a demon no man could tame. Folks came from miles away just to watch it thrash against its chains, until one poor rancher walked into town, looked into its eyes, and saw something no one else dared to see. Stay with me, because what happened after he bought the most dangerous animal in Arizona is a story you won't forget. The sun hung mercilessly over Redwood Gulch that afternoon, turning the air thick with heat and dust. Red powder from the valley floor drifted in the wind like powdered brick, clinging to boots' coats and eyelashes. It swirled lazily around the main square, where a crowd had grown rowdy and impatient, circling the spectacle at the very center. Driven deep into the ground stood a thick iron post, wide as a man's wrist. Heavy chains were wrapped around its base and stretched outward to the massive figure tethered there, a giant horse dark as storm clouds and twice as foreboding. The townsfolk called him Thunderjaw. A crudely painted sign hung from the post, the letters uneven and streaked by weather, 10 cents to see the beast, 25 cents if you dare get close. Dozens had gathered shoulder to shoulder, stepping forward, only to fall back again in nervous excitement. Parents hoisted children up for a better view, miners elbowed one another for position, and travelers paused on their way to the saloon just to stare. To them, Thunderjaw was not an animal. He was a story one dipped in fear and retold around campfires until it became something close to legend. And yet, despite his massive frame, despite the chains pulling tight against his neck and chest, the horse did not rear or thrash. He merely stood there, trembling faintly, head bowed low toward the trampled earth beneath him. The square around him had turned to dust from how long he had stood, forced beneath the sun, his hooves digging grooves where he shifted only to relieve pain. Children darted forward with stones plucked from the roadside. One boy, thin, sunburnt, grinning, lobbed a rock hard into Thunderjaw's ribs. It struck with a sharp smack. The crowd erupted into laughter. "Do it again," someone shouted. Two cowboys, with nothing better to do, cracked their bullwhips in the air, above Thunderjaw's ears, the sound splitting through the heat. The horse flinched at the crack muscles, tightening instinctively, and that alone sent ripples of excitement through the people encircling him. "Get up, you worthless brute," one of them jeered. "Show us that famous temper nearby." A woman tugged her young daughter closer, pointing proudly toward the chained animal. "That's the killer horse, honey. The one that stomped a man into the dirt. Look well. Creatures like that don't come round often." Anyone who managed to make Thunderjaw jerk, jump, or breathe harder than before received slaps on the back and hoots of approval, as if cruelty were a sport and they were playing it for prizes. But Thunderjaw refused them their entertainment. His body shivered with exhaustion and fear, not rage. The panic lay buried deep, trapped beneath layers of blows and scars. Even when a stone struck his collarbone hard enough to echo, he didn't lift his head, and that somehow made the crowd even wilder. At the edge of the square, half shaded by the overhang of the saloon's porch, Sheriff Cormac Hale sat at a small table, one boot resting on a crate. The sheriff was a thick man with a red face and hands too soft for real work. He collected coins from a line of locals and travelers alike, stacking them into neat, shining piles. "Step right up," he called, voice dripping with practiced cheer. "Come see the beast that took a man's life. Don't be shy, worth every penny." Every time Thunderjaw flinched, Hale chuckled deep in his chest, as though the suffering of the chained creature was nothing more than a form of entertainment put on for his personal amusement. To him, Thunderjaw was a breathing bank, nothing less, nothing more. It was in the haze of this cruel afternoon that the sound of slow, uneven hoofbeats approached the square. Elias Boone, riding a weary dun mare, had just come into town intending to buy only salt nails and a small bundle of hay for the coming cold nights. He looked like a man carved from the same dust that clung to his boots, lean tired and quiet. But when he saw the crowd, he pulled gently on his reins and slowed his mare to a stop. The sunlight caught his face, lined with years of grief and labor, and glinted in the pale eyes that studied the scene before him. He had seen ugly things in his life, out on the frontier and in the aftermath of it. But something about this crowd, about the chained figure trembling under the sun, made him feel as though his own ribs had tightened around his heart. He dismounted, patting his mare's flank to keep her calm as he walked toward the ring of spectators. At first, he could hardly see over the hats and shoulders, but as he stepped closer, the crowd parted just enough for him to catch sight of Thunderjaw fully, a hulking horse with a neck like carved oak, shoulders broad enough to pull a wagon by himself. Yet every muscle trembled. His head hung so low the chain scraped the dirt. Sweat streaked down his coat, carving paths through the dust. The cruel sun turned each patch of heaving breath into a shimmering wave. Elias stepped forward, drawn in despite himself. As he reached the front of the crowd, he finally saw the truth not visible from afar. Thunderjaw's hide was a map of suffering. Old whip scars had healed into pale rope-like ridges. Fresh ones crossed them in angry red streaks. On the left side of his chest, a patch of hair had burned away entirely, leaving blackened, blistered skin behind. And on the front leg, a horseshoe had been hammered on crooked, so crooked that every shift of weight must have sent pain ricocheting up the leg. "How long's he been out here?" Elias muttered under his breath, but no one answered. Just then a boy hurled a stone the size of a clenched fist. It bounced off Thunderjaw's throat, making a sharp, hollow sound. The horse only jerked once. He didn't scream, didn't rear, didn't even look at the one who had thrown the stone. The crowd roared as if victory had been won. But something inside Elias twisted. The cruelty, the laughter, the indifference had crawled under his skin like fire ants. He clenched his jaw, feeling heat rise behind his eyes. He stepped forward again, boots thudding on the wooden platform that had been built to elevate Thunderjaw so everyone could see him. The boards creaked under his weight as he came to stand just a few feet from the horse. Up close, Thunderjaw was even larger than he had seemed from afar. But it wasn't his size that struck Elias. It was his eyes. Slowly, almost fearfully, Thunderjaw lifted his head enough for Elias to see the depths of them dark pools clouded with exhaustion, framed by lashes crusted with dust. There was no savagery in them, no madness, no killer's fury. There was only sorrow. And something else Elias recognized too well, the look of a creature who had endured more pain than any heart should be asked to bear. For a moment, the noise of the square, the laughter, the jeering, the crack of whips faded into a dull hum. Elias felt the world narrow to just the two of them, a broken man and a broken animal, standing in a place that had no use for mercy. He knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection, after Clara died, after the fever took both her and the unborn child they had waited for with quiet joy. He had felt the world collapse inward, felt his chest hollow out into a place where the wind echoed. And staring into Thunderjaw's eyes, he felt that hollow ache stir again. Not because he was breaking, but because he recognized another being who already had. A whisper slipped out of him without thought, barely louder than breath. "Dear God, what have they done to you?" Thunderjaw's ears twitched at the sound. He didn't pull away, didn't flinch. He simply stood there watching Elias with the quiet desperation of something that had not seen kindness in a very long time. And in that moment, under the burning sun, with dust swirling around his boots, Elias Boone understood something with the clarity of revelation. This was not a monster. This was a survivor. A soul beaten, starved, terrified, and chained until even fear itself had grown tired. A soul that deserved better than spectacle and cruelty and endless pain. Elias exhaled slowly. Whatever he had intended to do when he rode into Redwood Gulch, buy supplies, fix his ranch, return to solitude, didn't matter anymore. Because something fundamental had shifted inside him. What do you think Elias will do after seeing the fear and hope in that horse's eyes? Would you walk away? Or step closer when everyone else turns their back? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before we ride into the most powerful part of the story. For a long moment, Elias Boone simply stood there facing Thunderjaw, as if the rest of the world had faded into dust and silence. The crowd murmured around him, shifting with nervous energy, waiting for something, anything to happen. But Elias didn't look at them. His eyes remained locked on the great trembling creature before him, on the sorrow etched into every scar, on the flicker of life, still buried beneath layers of fear. When he finally turned away, it was not to leave. It was to face Sheriff Hale. The sheriff sat lounging behind his little table, lifting a handful of coins to let them spill loudly back into the pile. He seemed amused, as if the suffering of a living creature was a show put on for his private entertainment. Elias stepped forward, boots thudding firmly on the platform, and the crowd shifted as though anticipating a fight. Sheriff Hale smirked at him. "Something I can help you with." Boone Elias didn't blink. His voice came out steady, strong, and clear enough to cut through the desert heat. "How much to buy the horse?" The effect was immediate and absolute. It was as if someone had sucked all the sound out of Redwood Gulch. The jeers, the laughter, the cracking whips, the rustling boots, everything fell still. Even the dust in the air seemed to hang motionless for a heartbeat. Children who had been throwing rocks suddenly clung to their mothers' skirts. Men who moments earlier had been shouting leaned forward in disbelief. The sheriff straightened slowly in his chair, pushing his hat up with a single fingertip. "What did you say?" Hale asked, squinting as though the heat had warped the words. Elias didn't waver. "I asked how much. I'm buying him." A wave of whispers swept through the crowd like wind through dry grass. "Is he crazy? He wants to buy the killer horse. He'll be dead by nightfall." Sheriff Hale threw his head back and barked a laugh, a loud, disbelieving, mocking noise. "Well," now Hale said, tapping two fingers on the piles of coins in front of him, "if you're truly stupid enough to buy that demon, let's give it a proper price." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with mischief. $200, enough for you to take your new pet and get yourself the hell out of Redwood Gulch with it. A roar of laughter burst from the crowd. $200 was more than most ranchers made in a year. It was the kind of price a man tossed out when he wanted to end a conversation. Hale even turned away, already reaching for another handful of coins, assuming Elias would storm off. But Elias remained perfectly still. Slowly, he reached for the worn leather pouch at his belt. His fingers brushed over the flap hand, steady, though a tremor of emotion rippled beneath his skin. Then he pulled it open. What followed silenced Redwood Gulch for the second time that day. Elias poured everything he had onto Hale's table. Silver coins, tarnished but solid. A few precious gold pieces collected from odd jobs over the years. Bits of folded bills, entire years of saving and sacrifice. Metal clattered loudly against wood, each coin ringing sharp as a hammer blow. The sheriff's grin faltered. "Count it," Elias said quietly. "You'll find it's enough." The murmurs in the crowd grew frantic. "He ain't got a death wish. He's got a whole death plan. That horse'll tear him apart." Boone must have lost what little sense he had left. A woman near the front clasped her hands together, shaking her head. "He's mad. Absolutely mad. That beast will crush him the first chance it gets." But Elias didn't acknowledge any of them. His gaze remained fixed on Hale, who for once looked uncertain. The sheriff picked through the coin's lips, moving as he counted. His eyes widened bit by bit, until even he couldn't hide the truth. It was enough. It was more than enough. Before Hale could speak, chaos erupted. A cowboy near Elias shouted, "Boone, you buying that monster for fertilizer, might as well bury yourself next to it." Laughter exploded loud and cruel. Another voice hollered, "2 days. I give him 2 days before it stomps his skull in." Several people spat curses at Elias for ruining their entertainment, while others backed away nervously, as if simply witnessing the transaction invited misfortune. The disturbance parted suddenly as a large man shoved forward through the crowd. Harlan Tate. His face was flushed red from drink stubble bristling across his jaw, eyes bloodshot with rage. The smell of whiskey clung to him like another layer of sweat. "You can't buy that beast," Harlan roared, jabbing a finger toward Thunderjaw. "It killed my brother. That thing should be strung up by sundown." The crowd took up the cry immediately. "Hang it. Kill the brute. Makes more sense than selling it." Thunderjaw flinched at the noise, just a tiny movement. But Elias saw it, and something inside him tightened with anger on the horse's behalf. Harlan, emboldened by the crowd, stepped closer to Elias. His spit flew with every word. "You buy it, Boone, and you're signing your own death warrant." Thunderjaw trembled at the shout, lowering his head again, as if preparing for another blow. Before the mob could build further momentum, a new voice cut through the noise, thin, raspy, but commanding, enough to silence several people at once. Enough. Doc Samuel Wells, the town's aging veterinarian, pushed his way through the bodies, leaning heavily on a walking stick, but moving with purpose. His sunken cheeks and narrow frame made him look fragile, but his eyes burned with a sharp, uncompromising intelligence. He stepped up beside Elias and pointed a bony finger at Thunderjaw. "This horse didn't turn dangerous on its own," he said, raising his voice so all could hear. "It was made that way, or tried to be." The crowd shifted, uncertain now. Doc Wells continued, "Harlan kept this animal chained inside a mountain cave through 3 months of winter. No light, no warmth, barely any food, beaten whenever it stumbled. I saw the wounds myself." A hush swept through the square, brittle and uncomfortable. He gestured toward Thunderjaw's scars. That long welt across his flank, rope burn from being tied too long. Those patches on his chest, fire burns. And that hoof hammered on crooked, probably in the dark. A few people looked down at their boots, suddenly unwilling to meet the horse's gaze. Harlan bristled fists, clenching at his sides. Liar. That animal was born mean, but even as he said it, he looked away, eyes sliding toward the saloon, avoiding the stares now turning suspiciously in his direction. Fear rippled through the crowd. Not of the horse, but of something else, the realization that they might have been cheering the torment of an innocent creature. Sheriff Hale, sensing the shift and the danger of losing his newfound pile of money, acted quickly. "All right," he shouted, scraping the coins into his pouch so fast, several rolled off the table. "Deal's done. Thunderjaw belongs to Boone now. Get it out of here before someone decides to change their mind." A few men booed, but most remained silent discomfort, warring with curiosity. Elias reached for the chain. Before he could grasp it, Harlan Tate stepped in close, so close Elias could smell the bitter whiskey on his breath. The crowd instinctively opened a path for him, as though he carried a sickness no one wanted to touch. Harlan leaned in, voice low and venomous. "That horse will kill you, Boone. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but it will. Remember I said it." Elias didn't flinch. He simply stared back, calm, steady, resolute. Harlan sneered and shoved away through the crowd, which split before him like water parting around a jagged stone. Finally, the sheriff thrust the chain toward Elias. "Take it," he said, anxious to wash his hands of the matter. The chain felt heavier in Elias Boone's hand than he expected, colder too, as if the metal had stored every ounce of fear and suffering the horse had ever endured. Thunderjaw stood trembling at the center of Redwood Gulch. And though the crowd continued to mutter to curse to predict his violent death, something had changed. A strange hush settled over the square, and every eye fixed itself on the man who had just bought the most feared creature in the territory. Elias stepped onto the wooden platform, each footfall echoing through the square like a warning drum. The air was thicker than desert heat, heavier than dust. It held anticipation, disbelief, and a current of fear that made even seasoned cowhands swallow hard. He moved slowly, deliberately toward Thunderjaw. The giant horse reacted instantly. His muscles tightened beneath his scarred hide, bunching like ropes, pulled taut enough to snap. His chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, each breath sharp and ragged. His ears flicked and jerked with every sound behind him, every whisper, every footstep, every shifting boot, like he expected a blow to fall at any moment. To the crowd, it looked like the prelude to a violent explosion. To Elias, it looked like a creature bracing for pain. He lifted his hand, not in threat, not in demand, but open palm up slow as drifting smoke. He wanted the horse to see it, wanted Thunderjaw to know that he held no whip, no stone, no tool of hurt. Easy. Easy now. Elias' murmured voice low, but steady. Thunderjaw's eyes widened, dark and wet. The whites showed for a moment before he blinked them away. His breath hitched again, as if torn between instinct and exhaustion. Elias took another step forward. He kept his boots soft on the wood, careful not to startle him further. The distance between them shrank until only a few feet remained close enough for Thunderjaw to break him in a heartbeat if fear finally snapped into violence. Close enough for kindness to mean something. "Easy, big fella," Elias whispered again, softer this time, the words rolling gently through the tense air. "I ain't here to hurt you." Something shifted in Thunderjaw's rigid stance, subtle, fleeting, but real. The frantic edge in his eyes dulled confusion, flickering where panic had lived. His breath, still sharp, lost a fraction of its desperation. For the first time, he seemed to hear the voice addressing him. Not as a command, not as a threat, but as reassurance. The crowd didn't see it. They just saw Elias stepping into the strike zone of a monster. A man shouted, "Boone, get back. It'll take your head off." Another hollered, "That thing's gonna explode." But Elias didn't waver. He moved 1 inch closer, slow enough that even the dust seemed to hesitate in the air. Then he lifted his hand the final distance and pressed his palm against the damp warmth of Thunderjaw's neck. Thunderjaw flinched so hard the chain rattled violently. A collective gasp tore through the spectators. Several people turned away, certain they were about to witness bloodshed. But Thunderjaw didn't strike. He didn't rear. He didn't even step back. Instead, after a trembling moment, he let out a shuddering breath, one that shook down the entire length of his body. His eyelids dropped halfway, as though he couldn't quite believe the hand on him wasn't delivering pain. It was the first gentle touch he had felt in years. Elias kept his palm there, steady and calm, letting the horse lean into it if he wished, or pull away if he needed. The heat rising from Thunderjaw's skin pulsed like a heartbeat beneath his fingertips. "It's all right," Elias murmured. "You're all right now." Thunderjaw closed his eyes completely, and for that brief, miraculous moment, he stood still. Pure stillness. No rage, no rearing, no madness. Only a colossal creature trembling under the human hand resting against his neck. The effect on the crowd was instantaneous. Screams and warnings burst from every direction. "Move away, he's winding up, that beast is tricking him. Parents yanked children behind them as though Elias were a bomb about to detonate. Several men stumbled backward so quickly they tripped over their own boots, crashing into the dirt in a panic. But Thunderjaw didn't move. He just breathed heavy and uneven, but not wild, and not violent. The quiet between horse and man grew thick enough to swallow every frantic cry around them. Elias finally withdrew his hand and reached down toward the chain. His fingers found the large padlock set into the collar plate. The metal was stiff, rusted in places, biting into his knuckles as he struggled to turn the key Sheriff Hale had given him. With a sudden snap, the lock clicked open. The sound rang across the square like a gunshot. Thunderjaw jerked, muscles rippling, but he did not lash out. The heavy chain slithered from its fittings and crashed to the ground, with a dull clang coiling like a dead serpent around Elias's boots. "You're free of that," Elias said quietly. "Now let's get you out of here." He gathered the lead rope, gently giving it only the faintest pull. Thunderjaw hesitated. For a second, his hooves dug into the earth, as though he feared the chain would yank him backward again. But when nothing pulled him, when nothing punished him, he stepped forward. Just one step. The dust beneath his hoof lifted like smoke. Then another step, and another. The giant horse began to walk beside Elias. A chorus of curses erupted behind them. "You ruined the show, that monster's cursed, hey Boone. Hope your will is written." A handful of boys threw dirt clods in frustration. One bounced off Thunderjaw's hind leg, another struck his flank. He tensed but didn't lash out. He kept moving forward, head low, as if he had lived through far worse than childish cruelty. Elias didn't turn around a single time. He walked through the parted crowd like a man crossing into a new life, Thunderjaw shadowing him with each unsteady stride. When they reached the edge of the square, Elias chose the narrow trail leading out of town, one that snaked upward into the foothills, instead of circling back toward the wagon road. Bringing Thunderjaw onto a wagon would have meant binding him again, confining him. And after what had been done to him, Elias refused to force the horse back into anything resembling imprisonment. "You'll walk with me," he said gently, "even if it's slow." Slow was an understatement. Thunderjaw's movements were labored each step, a careful test against pain in his crooked hoof. His legs wobbled from exhaustion and starvation. The long hours in the sun had drained nearly everything he had left. After only a short climb along the trail, his knees buckled slightly. Elias stopped immediately. "Easy. Easy now, don't push too hard." He set down his pack, took out the small water flask he carried, and held it up. Thunderjaw's nostrils quivered. He leaned in and drank greedily, gulping in short bursts. Elias tilted the flask slow enough that the water didn't spill, watching the horse reclaim a small sliver of strength with each swallow. "That's it, boy," he murmured. "No one's going to hurt you anymore. Not while I'm here." Thunderjaw lifted his head, breath heavy but steadier now, and stared at Elias with something new in his gaze, an emotion fragile and searching. Trust, or the beginning of it. The sun slipped lower with each mile they traveled. The sky faded from harsh blue to soft gold, then to a deepening orange that painted the hills with warmth. By the time the land began to open into a flat stretch of grassland, the first stars were glimmering. Boone Ranch appeared at last on the horizon, little more than a sagging fence line, a leaning barn, and a small cabin patched with mismatched boards. It was humble, worn, barely holding itself together. But Elias exhaled softly. He was home. Thunderjaw seemed to sense the shift. His ears pricked forward, nostrils testing the sense of an unfamiliar place. The ranch was quiet, no chains, no smoke, no cruel voices. Only the rustle of dry grass and the distant call of a night bird. Not much to look at, Elias admitted, rubbing the horse's shoulder. But it's safe. He led Thunderjaw into the corral, closing the gate behind them. The sky had turned a dark velvet by then, the moon casting pale light over the worn boards of the barn. Elias lit an oil lamp and hung it near the gate so Thunderjaw wouldn't be left in darkness. He'd learned enough about the horse in a short time to know darkness wasn't kind to him. Thunderjaw paced slowly, snorting at the shadows, visibly calmer than earlier, but still vigilant. Then the sky cracked open. A jagged bolt of lightning split the horizon, followed almost instantly by a clap of thunder so loud it made the corral boards vibrate. Thunderjaw reared halfway before slamming down, hard hooves pounding the earth in frantic, uneven blows. He swung his head, eyes blown wide with terror, the whites stark against the lamplight. Another thunderclap erupted closer this time. Thunderjaw lost control. He crashed sideways into the corral wall, scrambling chest, heaving violently. The sound that tore from him was not rage, it was fear. Deep, primal fear burned into him by months locked inside a freezing cave while storms raged overhead. "Easy, easy, boy," Elias shouted, but he didn't dare step too close. One blind kick could shatter bone. Thunderjaw kept backing away from the sky as though the thunder itself were a weapon raised against him. He paced in tight circles, stumbling throat, producing harsh, panicked grunts. Elias pressed himself against the fence, calculating when and how to intervene without getting trampled. Then finally, the storm began to drift east. The thunder softened from violent cracks to distant rumbles. Lightning flickered farther away, swallowed gradually by clouds. Thunderjaw's frantic stomping slowed. His breathing, still ragged, began to even out. His massive body shivered uncontrollably, drenched in sweat. His eyes lost none of their panic, but the blind edge faded, leaving behind a hollow, haunted look. The look of an animal dragged unwillingly back into memory and misery. Elias stepped forward cautiously. "It's all right," he whispered. I know. I know what they did to you. But you're not there anymore." Thunderjaw stared at him, not fully comprehending, but hearing the gentleness, the steadiness, the absence of cruelty. "You're safe now," Elias murmured, resting one hand lightly on the rail. "I understand. I won't let that happen to you again." Thunderjaw shuddered once more. And though the storm had passed, the weight of its memory hung in the air, thick as the scent of rain on dust. But for the first time, the horse was not alone in the darkness, and neither was the man watching over him. Morning light crept slowly over Boone Ranch, slipping through the thinning branches of the cottonwoods and spreading across the worn fences and leaning barn. The storm had passed hours ago, leaving the ground damp and the air washed clean, but the memory of thunder still clung to the corral like smoke. Elias Boone hadn't slept. He'd remained outside the corral until dawn, watching Thunderjaw calm from a trembling frenzy to a weary stillness. The giant horse now stood under the rising sun, with steam rising faintly from his sweat-soaked coat. His breaths were slower, but still heavy. His eyes, dark, exhausted, troubled, held the remnants of a night full of fear. Just as the first warm streaks of daylight broke across the hillside, a figure approached along the dirt path. Dr. Samuel Wells arrived with his usual tired gait, leaning slightly to one side as he carried a scuffed leather satchel filled with veterinary tools. His coat flapped around his thin frame, and the morning chills seemed to cling to him as tenaciously as the dust. Elias met him halfway through the yard. "Morning, Doc." "Morning," the old man replied, though his voice carried little brightness. He scanned the ranch with a practiced eye before turning toward the corral. "Heard there was a bit of trouble last night." "You all right?" "I'm fine," Elias said. He wasn't. Doc Wells nodded, already stepping toward the fence. Let me have a look. Thunderjaw watched him approach with shallow, wary breaths. He didn't bolt, didn't rear or lunge, but a tremor rippled along his body as Doc came close. The veterinarian paused only a moment before climbing through the broken slats of the corral. He moved slowly, carefully, every motion deliberate. When he reached Thunderjaw, he exhaled a long, troubled sigh. My God, he whispered. I don't know how in the world he's still alive. Elias stood just outside the rail, listening as the doctor began to examine the massive horse. Doc leaned closer, fingers hovering near Thunderjaw's flank. The scars there were stark in the morning light, long jagged welts running like dead branches across the hide. His gaze moved from the burn marks on the chest to the deep rope grooves around the neck, still faintly red, even after weeks of healing. Then his eyes dropped lower, landing on the crooked front horseshoe. That, Doc said quietly, is the worst shoeing job I've ever seen. Every step must feel like walking on a broken bottle. Thunderjaw lifted the hoof slightly, as though the mention alone reminded him of the pain. Doc shook his head. Oh boy, what they did to you. Elias swallowed hard. He wanted to look away, but forced himself to see every wound, every indignity that Thunderjaw had endured. He owed the horse that much. Tell me, Doc, he said finally. All of it. What Harlan did. The veterinarian hesitated. He let his hand rest gently on Thunderjaw's shoulder as he spoke. It's not a story a good man likes telling. Tell it anyway, Elias said. I need to know. Doc took a breath. Harlan kept this horse in a cave up near Black Ridge. You know the place the wind cuts like a knife and the cold settles into your bones by October. Elias nodded grimly. He shoved Thunderjaw in there at the start of winter, tied him to a stone outcropping by the neck and legs. No light, little warmth. Damp as a grave. Doc's voice roughened. He called it training, said it'd take the fight out of any animal. Thunderjaw shifted uneasily, as if the words themselves brought back the memory. There were days, Doc continued, when he didn't feed him anything but moldy hay or nothing at all. And nights when Harlan's boys would go up there with sticks and ropes, thinking they were helping break a dangerous horse. Elias felt a hot knot tightening in his chest. Doc's jaw clenched. The burns you see on him? They weren't accidents. And those deep rope scars? Well, that happens when an animal tries to escape the only way it can, by pulling until the rope cuts through its own skin. Elias closed his eyes. Thunderjaw turned his head slightly, watching him. He wasn't born wild, Doc said softer now. He was driven to it. Push any creature far enough, isolate it long enough. It'll lose pieces of itself just to survive. Elias opened his eyes again, jaw tight. He's not a monster. No, Doc agreed, patting Thunderjaw gently. He's a survivor. The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. From that day forward, Elias devoted himself entirely to helping Thunderjaw heal physically, and maybe someday in spirit as well. He began by tackling the worst of the pain. In the barn, with the light slanting through the wooden slats, he knelt beside Thunderjaw's injured hoof. Removing the crooked shoe was a slow, careful process. The nails were bent at cruel angles, biting deep into the hoof wall. Elias worked with quiet patience, talking softly as he eased each one loose. That's it. You're all right. Thunderjaw stood trembling, but didn't try to pull away. Once the shoe came free, Elias saw the damage beneath splintering cracks, spiderwebbing through the hoof. He cleaned it gently, wrapping it with treatment the doctor had prepared. After that came the wounds. Elias washed the scars and burns with warm water, wincing each time Thunderjaw flinched. He cleaned away the dried mud caked around the fetlocks and brushed through tangles of mane and tail that had gone untouched for months. He spoke to the horse constantly, while he worked not full sentences, but quiet reassurance. "You're doing good. Easy now. No one's gonna hurt you." At first, Thunderjaw trembled at every approach. Instinct told him to run, to flee, to defend himself. But Elias moved slowly, consistently, predictably. His touch, once strange, became familiar. And soon, something changed. When Elias walked toward him with a brush, Thunderjaw no longer stepped back. When a hand lifted near his neck, he didn't jerk away. When Elias pressed his palm gently to the horse's chest, he felt only a faint tremor instead of the earlier rigid bracing. Healing came in small victories. On the fourth morning, one such victory arrived, like a gift neither of them had expected. The ranch was wrapped in dense fog, thick enough to soften every outline and blur the distant tree line. The ground was cool underfoot, and dew clung to the rails of the corral. Elias crossed the yard carrying a bucket of water, the quiet sound of chickens somewhere in the mist. As he stepped into the corral, Thunderjaw lifted his head not in alarm, but in recognition. His breath puffed in pale clouds as he walked slowly toward Elias. Then, as the man came to a stop near the center of the pen, Thunderjaw lowered his head and gently touched his muzzle to Elias's shoulder. Just a small gesture, barely a moment. But Elias froze, stunned by what it meant. Trust, the faintest spark of it. He set the bucket down and placed a hand on the horse's cheek. Thunderjaw leaned into it. For the first time since he'd lost Clara and the child they'd never met, Elias felt something inside him loosen, something tight and painful that had lived in his chest for far too long. "You're a good boy," Elias whispered. "Better than anyone deserves." The moment ended when the wind shifted, clearing the fog. Thunderjaw stepped back, but the connection remained. A silent promise had been made between them. Later that afternoon, the sky began to dim. Clouds gathered over the mountains, stacking upon each other until the entire ridge darkened. The air felt charged, prickling with the electric tension of an impending storm. Elias didn't like the look of it. He grabbed a hammer and a handful of nails to mend a sagging fence post at the far end of the property. Thunderjaw grazed near the barn, keeping him in sight. The first gust of wind cut through the valley, carrying the metallic scent of rain. Elias straightened, glancing toward the ridge just in time to see lightning flash, jagged and violent. And then came the sound. A thunderclap tore across the sky with enough force to shake the ground. A sharp crack echoed from the hill above. One of the old pines, already split from years of storms, gave way. Another thunder boom struck, and the tree snapped fully, beginning its deadly fall. Elias turned too late. The massive trunk crashed downhill. The branches slammed into him with brutal force, pinning his right leg beneath a twisted tangle of limbs. Pain shot up his body. Damn it. He tried to yank himself free, but the weight was crushing, immovable. Rain began to fall, thin, cold sheets cutting through the air. Thunderjaw had heard the crash. His head shot up, ears pricked. A second later, Elias saw him tearing across the yard, hooves pounding the wet earth. Lightning flashed again. Thunderjaw faltered, but only for a heartbeat. Instead of running from the storm, he ran straight toward Elias. "Easy, easy, boy, don't hurt yourself," Elias shouted, though the wind carried half the words away. Thunderjaw skidded to a stop beside him, nostrils flaring, fear shining in his eyes. But he didn't back away. He didn't flee from the thunder like the night before. He stayed. He planted his massive body between Elias and the wind, shielding him from the brunt of the storm. Another thunderclap boomed. Thunderjaw flinched, but he didn't move. "Good boy. Good boy." Elias breathed, gritting his teeth through pain. Thunderjaw lowered his head, gripping a large branch with his teeth. He heaved backward, muscles straining beneath his hide. The branch shifted. Again Elias gasped. Pull again. Thunderjaw planted his hooves strained and dragged the heavy limb far enough that Elias could drag himself free. Pain tore through him as he lurched forward, but he cleared the danger. They stumbled together toward the barn, both panting, one from exertion, the other from agony. Inside the shelter of the overhang, Elias leaned heavily against the wall. Thunderjaw pressed close breath warm against Elias's chest. You saved me, Elias whispered. The horse lowered his head, touching Elias's shoulder once more. Outside, thunder still rolled across the mountains, but inside the barn, for the first time, Thunderjaw was calm, and Elias Boone knew without doubt that something had changed forever between them. In the days that followed the storm, a quiet rhythm began to settle over Boone Ranch, something fragile, something new, something that felt almost like the beginnings of a life, rebuilt from ashes. The air still smelled of wet earth and pine after the downpour, but the valley had returned to its slow, steady heartbeat. The calls of distant birds, the groan of old wood in the wind, and the soft scuff of hooves moving steadily across the yard. Ever since Thunderjaw had saved Elias's life on that storm-split hillside, something unspoken yet powerful tied the two of them together. There was no ceremony to mark it, no handshake or oath, but both man and horse seemed to understand, instinctively, that they were no longer just owner and animal. They were survivors of different tragedies, bound now by the simple fact that each had chosen the other when it mattered most. Elias began restoring the ranch with a determination he hadn't felt in years. The fences had nearly collapsed in sections. The irrigation ditch was clogged with debris. The field behind the barn was so littered with stones it could barely grow weeds. But for the first time since Clara's grave cooled, Elias felt something other than grief urging him forward. He felt purpose again. Thunderjaw followed him everywhere. When Elias hauled lumber across the yard, Thunderjaw walked behind him, lowering his great neck to lift the heavier beams with his teeth. When Elias dug holes for fence posts, Thunderjaw waited with patient stillness nearby, ears flicking, watching every motion, until Elias made a simple hand sign. Then the massive horse leaned his shoulder into the post, driving it deep into the earth, with a single powerful push. Neighbors used to say a man needed 6 ranch hands to do the work Elias attempted alone. Now, with Thunderjaw beside him, he didn't need even one. A few days into their new routine, as Elias was clearing out the lower pasture, he let out a soft whistle, pure instinct, a sound he hadn't used since training his father's old workhorse decades ago. Thunderjaw stopped grazing and lifted his head. A moment later, he walked toward Elias with surprising calm, ready for whatever came next. Elias chuckled under his breath. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "You really do listen." Thunderjaw flicked an ear as if to say he'd been listening all along. Each passing day chipped away at the wariness that had once defined their interactions. There were no sudden movements, no unpredictable flinches. They learned each other's rhythms, the cadence of footsteps, the shape of breath, but the intention behind a gesture. Where fear once lived, familiarity began to take root. And while Thunderjaw was changing, Elias was healing too. Every time he stepped out of the cabin in the early morning light and saw the horse standing patiently by the fence, dark against the pale dawn, something in Elias's chest tightened and loosened at the same time. It was a feeling he hadn't known since Clara stood in the kitchen doorway smiling at him over a steaming bowl of coffee. The memories still hurt. They always would. The image of Clara's pale face On the final night, the silent weight of the unborn child they never got to hold, those pains still stirred when storms rolled across the mountains, or when the sky carried that same gray tint it had on the day he buried them. But now, when the ache rose like a tide, Elias only needed to look at Thunderjaw standing steady beneath the cottonwoods to remember that he wasn't walking through life alone anymore. Thunderjaw had nightmares of his own. Sometimes at night he snorted and stamped, caught in dreams of rope and darkness of the cave where he'd been left to suffer for months. But when Elias's lantern light flickered through the slats of the barn, Thunderjaw's breathing slowed. He would poke his great head out of the stall, brushing Elias's shoulder as if to say he was all right, that the past hadn't claimed him tonight. Slowly, gently, the ranch became a sanctuary for them both. Thunderjaw's transformation was remarkable. The animal who had once quivered at the snap of a whip now barely flicked an ear when the mail wagon rattled by with its leather straps clapping in the wind. Thunder no longer sent him into frenzied panic. Instead, he lifted his head, studied the sky, and let the sound roll past him like a distant wave. His coat, once dull and matted, shone in the sunlight, thanks to Elias's persistent grooming. His mane grew fuller, smoother, no longer streaked with mud and fear. His eyes changed most of all. The haunted, hollow look gave way to something clearer, calmer, as though he finally believed that the world wasn't waiting to harm him. People began to talk. Arizona territory was wide, but news traveled faster than most would imagine. Cowboys moving up from the south whispered about Boone and his devil horse. Homesteaders passing along the trade trail told stories of the massive black animal that had been chained up in Redwood Gulch, now seen working quietly beside its new owner. Some tales were exaggerated, of course. Folks liked to embellish. One rumor claimed Thunderjaw had pulled an entire barn back into place after the storm. Another insisted the horse understood every word Elias spoke like some ancient spirit, wearing the body of a beast. Regardless of how the stories morphed, one truth stayed firm. Thunderjaw was no longer the monster they had believed him to be. When residents of Redwood Gulch passed near Boone Ranch, they slowed their horses without meaning to. Some removed their hats out of instinctive respect. Others simply stared. They saw Elias hammering a new gate into place. They saw Thunderjaw standing near him, nudging a wooden beam with his nose so the man could reach it more easily. Not a single person dared call the horse a demon anymore. Shame had replaced their mockery, shame at what they had believed, what they had done, and how eagerly they had once thrown stones at a creature too broken to defend itself. Sometimes the same children who had hurled rocks in the town square now watched silently from a distance, unsure how to reconcile the gentle giant before them with the beast they had been taught to fear. Thunderjaw never paid them any mind. His world now centered only on the ranch, the work, and the man who had offered him kindness when no one else would. One evening, after a long day of mending fence lines and clearing tumbleweed, the sky melted into shades of molten gold. The sun dipped low over the hills, spilling warm light across the field. Elias stood on the porch of his small cabin, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. The world felt quiet, peaceful in a way Elias hadn't experienced since before tragedy had carved its mark on his life. Thunderjaw approached at an unhurried pace, his silhouette glowing in the honey-colored light. He stopped beside Elias, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. His breath blew softly across Elias's arm, warm and steady. Then Thunderjaw lowered his head and gently nudged Elias's shoulder. A gesture simple, honest, profound. Elias swallowed, overcome by the softness of the moment. He lifted a hand and placed it on Thunderjaw's neck, feeling the warmth, the strength, the heartbeat beneath the skin. His voice came out low, rough, but steady. "We're both still standing, boy. And that's enough." Thunderjaw released a slow, contented breath as though agreeing. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the land, wrapping them in gold. A man and a horse, both battered, both scarred, stood together on the porch of a ranch that had once been empty and forgotten. But now, it was home. For both of them. By the end of summer, the story of Boone's giant black horse had traveled farther than any rider in Redwood Gulch. Men at the saloon talked about it between drinks. Ranch wives repeated it over laundry lines. Children whispered it under their blankets at night, how the devil horse had saved a poor rancher's life in a storm. How it now worked quiet and steady on a lonely ranch instead of tearing men apart. And as the tale spread, something else happened, something Harlan Tate could neither stomach nor control. The people of Redwood Gulch started changing how they spoke about Thunderjaw. They didn't call him a demon anymore. They lowered their voices when they mentioned the cave and the chains and the scars. Some even muttered that maybe the horse hadn't been the real monster in the story. Every lowered voice, every sidelong glance, every half-finished sentence was a knife under Harlan's skin. He'd lost his freak show attraction in the square. Lost the coins people used to throw just for a chance to hurt the animal. Lost his favorite target for cruelty. Now he was losing the story too. One night, drunker than usual, he slammed his empty bottle down on the saloon table so hard the glass cracked. I'll tell you what he snarled to the two shiftless cowhands slouched across from him. That horse is still mine. Boone just walked off with it like he owns the world. But that animal is worth more than his whole damn ranch. The men exchanged a wary glance. Heard that horse saved Boone's life, one of them said slowly. Don't sound like a bad trade to me. Harlan's face flushed a dangerous red. Saved his life, he spat. That thing killed my brother. You think I'm gonna sit here and let folks turn it into some kind of hero? He leaned forward, voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You boys want easy money. That horse is worth a fortune to the right buyer. Or at the very least, we make sure it dies like it should have in the first place. He didn't have to say more. Greed did the rest. By the time the sun set the next evening, 3 men rode out of Redwood Gulch and into the stony hills, their horses' silhouettes thin and sharp against the fading light. They rode hard, cutting along the edge of the ridge, where the land dropped away into dark gulches and dry washes. Harlan led shoulders hunched, jaw-tight, whiskey still sour in his breath. One of the younger men slowed as the trail dipped toward the valley where Boone Ranch sat in its quiet hollow. You sure about this? He muttered. Heard folks say that horse ain't what it used to be. Heard Boone treats it like a partner. Harlan reined his horse around so sharply the animal tossed its head. Boone's a nobody, he growled. A broke dirt farmer who got lucky. He doesn't deserve that horse. We're just taking back what's worth having. The others didn't argue. But as the sky slid into purple, and crickets began their shrill chorus, a chill moved through the valley that had nothing to do with the breeze. Something dark was coming. They reached the edge of Boone Ranch long after night had swallowed the hills. The cabin windows glowed faintly, and a single lantern burned near the corral where Thunderjaw slept in the rebuilt stall. Stay here, Harlan hissed. I'll flush the beast out. Once it's loose and panicked, you grab the reins, and we're gone. Boone won't know what hit him. Torch in hand, he slid along the shadows toward the barn. Inside, Thunderjaw heard the footsteps. He lifted his head, nostrils, flaring ears pricked toward the sound of someone moving where no one should be. The faint scent of smoke rode the air wrong and sharp. His muscles tightened. Harlan crouched by a stack of dry straw near the far wall and touched the torch to it. The flame caught quickly, too quickly. He intended a small blaze to drive the horse out, but the wind slipped in through the cracks of the stall, feeding the fire like a hungry mouth. Within seconds, it crawled up the boards, licking at the supports, leaping from bale to bale. The barn began to glow from within. Thunderjaw snorted, eyes wide, as the heat hit his face. He stamped, backing away, then lunged toward the door, but the metal latch held. His hooves hammered the earth. The stall shook. "Move, damn you," Harlan hissed, stepping back from the now roaring tongues of fire. "Get out of there." He hadn't counted on how fast the flames would spread. Outside in the cabin, Elias woke to a strange glow pushing through the cracks around the door. The air smelled wrong, hot and acrid, tinged with the bite of burning wood. Then he heard it. Thunderjaw's panicked bellow. Thunderjaw Elias was out of bed and through the door before the echo faded. Night hit him full in the face, cold and full of smoke. The barn was half wreathed in flames, orange light clawing up into the sky. He sprinted toward it, heart pounding. "Easy, boy, I'm coming." As he reached the barn door, a burning beam cracked overhead with a deafening pop. Elias threw his arms up instinctively. The beam slammed into him, driving him to the ground. For a second, the world dissolved into sparks and pain. He rolled coughing, feeling the heat wash over him in waves. Fire roared between him and the stall. The doorway he'd meant to reach was now an inferno. Inside, Thunderjaw screamed. The horse could have turned and smashed through the opposite wall, tearing into the night and never looking back. Instead, he lowered his head and rammed his weight again and again into the weakest part of the stall. Once. Twice. The boards shuddered but held. A burning chunk of roof crashed, nearby embers showering over his back. He felt the sting of heat biting into his skin, but he charged the wall again. This time the boards split. Nails squealed free. The stall burst outward in a spray of splinters. Thunderjaw leapt through the opening, landing heavily on the flaming debris. He shook his mane, scattered sparks, then lunged across the smoky barn toward Elias's crumpled form near the door. Elias struggled to rise, coughing, vision blurred. The fire had cut him off from the exit. Every breath tasted of smoke and ash. He heard the thunder of hooves behind him and thought, absurdly, so this is it. But Thunderjaw barreled past, planting himself between Elias and the falling embers. The horse's massive body became a shield, catching heat and sparks across his shoulders. Then Thunderjaw lowered his head and shoved Elias with his chest and shoulder. Once. Twice. Pushing him inch by inch toward a gap where the wall had partially collapsed. "Easy, boy, easy," Elias gasped, letting himself be guided. He didn't have the strength to argue. They burst out together into the cooler night air, rolling away from the immediate reach of the flames. Elias groaned, clutching his ribs. Thunderjaw stood over him, panting sides, heaving soot streaking his already scarred coat. From the shadows near the corral, a shout ripped through the chaos. "Move, and I'll kill you both." Harlan Tate stepped forward, gun in hand, eyes wild with fury and drink, and something else, desperation maybe. "You were supposed to burn?" he snarled. "After what you did to my brother, you and that monster both should have died." Elias pushed himself onto one elbow, still coughing. "Your brother got drunk and went after a chained horse with a whip," he rasped. "Thunderjaw did what any creature would have done. You know that." Harlan's hand shook around the gun. "Shut up," he snapped. "You stole my horse. You turned this town against me. Tonight I fix that." He cocked the pistol. Thunderjaw could have bolted, could have fled into the open dark and left the man who had rescued him to fend for himself. Instead, he stepped forward. He placed his massive frame between Elias and Harlan, ears pinned, muscles taut, not with blind panic, but with a clear, focused protectiveness. Easy boy, Elias whispered from behind him. Don't do it. Don't go to him. A shot cracked. The bullet seared past Thunderjaw's ear close enough to slice a small red line along his skin. He jerked but did not charge. He stomped once, hooves striking sparks from the rock. His body trembled, but he held his ground. See? Harlan shouted, voice breaking. Still a killer. Look at him. One of the men who'd ridden with him edged backward into the shadows, face pale. You said just to scare Boone, he muttered. You didn't say nothing about killing him or burning his place down. Harlan didn't look at him. You want your money, you stay. You want to run, run. The man didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted into the dark horse's hoofbeats, fading quickly into the night. The other had already vanished. Harlan was alone. Alone with the burning barn behind him and the living consequences of his cruelty standing in front. The flames cast Thunderjaw's silhouette high against the smoke, throwing his scars into stark relief. Every welt, every burn, every patch of missing hair glowed in the firelight, an unmistakable map of everything Harlan had done. Thunderjaw pawed the ground again, but still didn't advance. He just stood there, breathing, hard eyes locked on the man who had tried to break him. And something in Harlan finally cracked. For the first time, he truly saw the animal before him. Not as a piece of property, not as a thing to be beaten into obedience, not even as the symbol of his brother's death. He saw what Doc Wells had tried to tell them all, a creature who had survived unspeakable cruelty and yet was not attacking now, was not tearing him apart. The horse had every right to sink its teeth into his throat to crush him under its hooves. But it didn't. It chose to stand between Elias and danger instead. The truth hit Harlan like a thrown stone. His brother hadn't died as a victim of some mindless beast. He'd died because he'd staggered drunk into a cave whip in hand, beating a chained and starving animal until it snapped in terror and pain. Harlan's throat worked, but no sound came out. The gun slipped from his fingers and thudded into the dirt. For a heartbeat, he stood there staring at Thunderjaw's scarred body, at Elias coughing behind him, at the burning wreckage of the barn, a monument to his own hatred. Then he turned and ran. He fled into the darkness between the hills, swallowed by the same shadows that had once hidden his sins. No one followed. When the last echo of his footsteps faded, the world reduced itself to the crackle of burning wood and the harsh breathing of horse and man. Elias pressed his forehead to Thunderjaw's shoulder, overwhelmed by smoke and relief and gratitude so deep it almost hurt. You did it again, he whispered. You stayed. You stayed with me. Thunderjaw's sides rose and fell. He let out a long, shuddering breath and lowered his head as if exhausted, as if the weight of the night had finally settled across his back. By the time dawn crawled over the horizon, the flames had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Neighbors who'd seen the glow in the night rode in with water and tools. Together, they helped Elias smother the last embers and pull the charred beams away. They stared wide-eyed at the blackened ruins at the man and the horse standing side by side in the gray morning light. What kind of monster saves its owner twice? Someone whispered under their breath. No one argued with him. In the weeks that followed the story of the fire and the confrontation spread across Arizona territory like sparks on dry grass. This time, no one could twist it into something ugly. They told it the same way from Prescott to the far edge of the San Pedro, how Harlan Tate had come in the night with violence in his hands, how he'd set the barn ablaze, and how the horse he'd once tortured had chosen not to trample him, but to save the man who loved him instead. People who had once thrown rocks now lowered their voices when speaking of Thunderjaw. Parents who had dragged their children to Redwood Gulch to gawk at the Devil Horse came to Boone Ranch with hats in hand. asking if their sons and daughters might meet him, not to poke or prod, and they said quietly, just to see him proper. Thunderjaw would stand by the fence as the children approached, eyes soft, posture calm, breathing slow. Some of them reached out with shaking fingers to touch his nose. Others only watched in reverent silence. Either way they left changed. Remember, their parents would say on the ride home he wasn't always treated kind. But he still chose kindness in the end. One autumn afternoon, the sky turned strange. Heavy clouds rolled in from the mountains, faster than anyone expected. Rain began in sudden, violent sheets, pounding the earth, turning dry creeks into churning torrents within minutes. Near town, a narrow wash swelled to 3 times its size, water foaming and crashing against its banks. A child's cry cut through the roar. A little boy swept off his feet while trying to cross. Panic erupted on the muddy bank. Sammy, his mother, screamed, clawing at the edge of the wash as the current tore her son away. Somebody help him. But the water moved too fast. No one dared step in. Horses reared back from the flood, eyes rolling white with fear. Men shouted over one another, yelling orders they didn't know how to follow. Then a shadow loomed at the edge of the chaos. Thunderjaw. He had been grazing near the trail when the shouting began. Now he stood poised at the top of the bank, soaked to the bone mane plastered to his neck. Elias dug his heels into the ground, trying to hold him back by the rope. "Wait, the current'll take you too," Elias shouted. But Thunderjaw pulled free. He plunged down the embankment without hesitation, hooves sliding in the mud, muscles bunching as he leaped into the raging water. The flood crashed against his chest, driving him sideways. He fought for balance legs, churning head-tossed high as debris battered against his flanks. Sammy, the mother, screamed again. The boy bobbed in the current, coughing eyes wide with terror. Thunderjaw lunged, teeth snapping at empty water, until finally he caught the back of the boy's shirt. The fabric tore once then held. The horse turned with all his strength, swimming against the pull of the flood. For a breathless moment it seemed impossible. Then his hooves struck something solid. He dug in, hauling both himself and the child toward the bank, one step at a time. Men scrambled forward, grabbing the boy's arms as soon as they were close enough. They dragged him up onto dry ground, where his mother fell over him, sobbing. Above them, Thunderjaw climbed out of the water sides, heaving, nostrils flaring. Mud streaked his legs. His coat glittered darkly with rain. People stared up at him in stunned silence. No one clapped. No one cheered. The moment felt too sacred for noise. Finally, someone whispered, "Odd, he's not a monster. He's a guardian." The name took root and grew. The Guardian of the Valley. Back at Boone Ranch that night, Elias stood in the doorway of the new barn, watching Thunderjaw sleep. The horse lay on his side in the straw, breathing deep and even completely at peace. There had been a time when Elias couldn't imagine a future that didn't hurt, when every morning felt like waking up inside a wound that never closed. Clara's laugh, the hope in her eyes when she told him about the baby, those memories had once cut him every time they rose. Now the memories still stung, but they were no longer knives. They were echoes. And between those echoes stood a giant black horse who had forced him to live again. "You pulled me out of that grave I dug in my own heart," Elias murmured. Did you know that boy Thunderjaw shifted in his sleep, one ear flicking lazily? Elias smiled. He realized fully now that the day he dropped $200 on a saloon table and bought a creature everyone else called cursed, he hadn't just freed the horse. He'd freed himself from the cage he'd built out of grief and loneliness. The sadness of Clara's absence still existed. It always would. But it no longer ruled him. It walked beside him instead like an old companion, and beside that walked something stronger gratitude. Thunderjaw, for his part, had found his true self again. Gone were the nights of frantic pacing at every storm. Gone were the days when every raised voice sent him crashing into walls. He rested now with his legs folded or stretched out entirely in the straw, utterly vulnerable, in a way only truly safe creatures ever dared to be. His eyes, when they opened to greet Elias in the morning, were clear, gentle, bright, with something that might even be called contentment. The scars on his body didn't fade, but they changed meaning. They were no longer marks of what had been done to him. They were proof of what he'd survived. Travelers began to seek out Boone Ranch on purpose. Some came just to look from the fence line. Others walked up respectfully, hats in hand, asking if they might work a season under Elias to learn how he'd turned a rage-torn animal into a guardian. Over time, the ranch stopped looking like a forgotten patch of earth. New fence posts stood straight. The barns shone with fresh wood. Grass returned to the fields. There were more voices in the yard, some human, some animal, but all of them threaded through with laughter and the steady creak of honest work. On a late afternoon, when the air was warm and the sky burned with the golden light of impending sunset, Elias led Thunderjaw up a gentle slope behind the house. The tall grass brushed their boots and fetlocks as they climbed. At the top, the land fell away into a wide view of the valley. The river glinted far off. Smoke from distant homesteads curled straight up into the calm air. The world felt big and quiet and alive. Thunderjaw stopped beside Elias, shoulder to shoulder. The wind combed through his mane. His eyes were calm, taking everything in with the slow understanding of a creature who had seen too much darkness to take light for granted. Elias reached up and laid a hand on his neck. "We found our way back to the world, boy," he said softly. "And maybe the world found its way back to us." Thunderjaw blew a gentle breath, warm against Elias's sleeve, and nudged his shoulder one last time, an answer, without words. The sun slipped lower, wrapping them both in a halo of amber light. A man and a horse, once broken now, standing steady on a hill above a valley that finally knew the truth about them. Their story hadn't ended in chains, or graves, or fire. It had ended in a choice. They chose to trust. They chose to stay. They chose to keep walking together. And sometimes, in a wild land that rarely gave anyone a second chance, that was the closest thing to a miracle the West would ever see. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this story. Your time and attention truly mean everything. If this journey touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional Wild West stories. Your support helps these stories keep riding on.